4 days. That is how long the most audacious plan in the history of football governance lasted before it collapsed completely. On Tuesday, the 28th of July, Gianni Infantino announced the creation of FIFA Forward Enterprise, a $20 billion commercial entity that would hold the rights to the World Cup and the Club World Cup and sell minority stakes to private investors, including, it emerged, a fund associated with the Kushner family. The plan had been conceived in secret. It had been presented to FIFA's member associations without prior consultation with the confederations that represent the sport's most commercially powerful communities. It had been attached to a September deadline with a $40 million payment promised to associations that signed up in time. On Friday, the 31st of July, 4 days later, Infantino published a statement. The FIFA Forward Enterprise project will not proceed. 9 words. After 4 days, after the most concerted institutional revolt in football governance history, after UEFA voted to boycott FIFA competitions, the first time European football's governing body had ever threatened to withdraw its nations from the World Cup, after CONCACAF expressed outrage, after the Asian Football Confederation stood in solidarity with UEFA, after 2 senior figures inside FIFA itself, including the organization's own chief operating officer, published statements saying staff had been deceived and the project must not continue. After one of those senior figures resigned as a presidential advisor, after Infantino's own colleagues told the world it was the project of one person. The project of one person. Those 5 words, written by Kevin Lamore, FIFA's chief operating officer, a longtime colleague of Infantino at both FIFA and UEFA, a man with institutional knowledge of the governing body that no external analyst can match, are the most damaging sentence published about FIFA's leadership since the federal indictments of 2015. Not from a rival, not from a critic, from inside the institution, from someone who knows exactly what he is describing. So what really happened across the most turbulent 4 days in football governance history? And what does the collapse of the FIFA Forward Enterprise Plan tell us about the state of the institution that collapsed it and the president who is still standing in its ruins? Let's go through both tracks, the specific sequence of events that produced the collapse and the institutional picture that the collapse has left behind, because both are extraordinary, and the honest examination of both is what this moment demands. Start with the Tuesday announcement, because the manner of the plan's introduction is as significant as its content, and it is the manner that produced the immediate and devastating institutional response. The FIFA Forward Enterprise Plan was conceived in secret. That is confirmed by the statement of FIFA's own chief operating officer, who said staff members were deceived by Infantino's lack of openness in planning the sale over recent months. Not surprised by the announcement, deceived by the process that preceded it. The people responsible for operating the world's most powerful sporting institution were not consulted about a proposal to create a $20 billion commercial entity and sell stakes in it to private investors. They found out when everyone else did. The plan's commercial architecture was specific and documented. FIFA Forward Enterprise would raise up to $4.2 billion later in the year based on an initial equity valuation of $20 billion by carefully selecting long-term investors who would purchase minority non-controlling interests. The investors in the proposed venture included, according to confirmed reporting, Joshua Kushner's Thrive Capital through a fund called Thrive Eternal. Joshua is the brother of Jared Kushner, whose family connections to the host nation's political ecosystem were already part of the documented context of the 2026 World Cup's governance story. The $40 million payment promised to each of FIFA's 211 member associations, conditioned on signing up by September 19th, was described by a senior football figure as pure bribery. That phrase, used by someone inside the sport who read the terms, captured the specific dynamic that made the proposal structure so immediately toxic. A significant financial payment, a compressed deadline, no transparency about governance terms, no prior consultation with confederations. Sign up now or receive a fraction of the promised sum. UEFA vowed to boycott FIFA competitions, an unprecedented step that European football's governing body had never previously taken. The threat of a European boycott of the World Cup, removing the continent whose nations generate the majority of the sport's global commercial value from the competition entirely, was the specific instrument that made the proposal's continuation impossible, regardless of how many smaller associations had signed up by September. Two senior FIFA officials criticized the plan earlier Friday, with one resigning as a presidential advisor and a second saying staff members were deceived by the project that must not go ahead. Carlos Cordero, a former Goldman Sachs banker who had served as a presidential advisor, resigned. His statement said he could not stand by while FIFA considered selling a stake in the World Cup and urged other senior FIFA staff to speak out. Within hours, Lamore published his own statement to a major newswire saying staff members were deceived by Infantino's lack of openness in planning the sale over recent months, and the project must not continue. It is the project of one person, not of FIFA's governance structure, not of its council, not of its member associations or confederations or the institutional community that is supposed to shape decisions of this magnitude. One person. That accusation, delivered by FIFA's own chief operating officer, who has worked alongside Infantino for years and who understands the institutional body's internal processes with the precision that only institutional seniority provides, is the sentence that will define the post-World Cup conversation about FIFA's leadership for months. Here's the interesting part. Because the collapse of the plan, while representing a spectacular defeat for Infantino, does not resolve any of the questions its announcement raised. The plan existed. It was conceived in secret. Senior FIFA staff were deceived about it for months. It was introduced to the world with a deadline attached to a financial payment that one football figure called bribery. It named the Kushner family among its investors at a moment that family connection to the host nation's political ecosystem was already part of the documented context of the tournament that generated the revenues the plan was built on. And Infantino's statement announcing the collapse made no acknowledgement of any of those specific failures. Having listened carefully to all the views, his statement said, it has become clear that the project has created divisions of a nature that, regardless of the level of support, are no longer in the interest of the objectives set out in the first place. Divisions of a nature. That phrase is the institutional equivalent of saying the weather was unfortunate. It attributes the collapse to the existence of disagreement rather than to the specific failures in process, transparency, and governance that produced that disagreement. Infantino did not say the plan was conceived improperly. He did not say staff should have been consulted. He did not say the September deadline was inappropriate. He said it created divisions. And then he said he planned to bring all interested parties back together in the coming days and weeks. Here is the counter-argument that deserves honest examination. Infantino's stated objective for the FIFA Forward Enterprise Plan was development funding for smaller associations. $40 million to each of 211 member associations represents a genuinely significant sum of money for football federations in countries where the sport is barely resourced. The development logic of the plan, bringing external capital into the sport to fund the growth of football in territories where it currently depends on FIFA's transfer payments for its basic infrastructure, is not without merit. That argument was available to Infantino from the moment the plan was announced. It is the argument the Czech FA president David Trunda made when he endorsed the proposal. It is the argument that might have been persuasive to a meaningful coalition of smaller associations had it been presented through a transparent governance process with proper consultation and adequate time for assessment. What made that argument impossible to sustain was the manner of the plan's introduction. Secret conception, staff deceived, no confederation consultation, a deadline attached to a financial payment, the Kushner connection in the context of a tournament where the host nation's leader had confirmed calling Infantino about a disciplinary reversal. The counter-argument, that the plan served genuine development purposes, collapsed under the weight of the process that delivered it, not the weight of the objective it claimed to serve. Now here is the bigger institutional picture that the four-day collapse leaves behind. Infantino is still FIFA's president. The plan collapsed, but he did not resign. His statement was a statement of someone who has retreated from a specific proposal while preserving his institutional position. He plans to bring all interested parties together. He will find new ways to grow the sport globally.
He remains in office with the full authority of his elected position. But two of his own senior officials have publicly said he deceived his colleagues and that the project was his alone. One of them resigned, the other has published a statement to a major newswire saying the project must not continue. UEFA has voted to boycott FIFA competitions, a step so extreme that it had never been taken before in the history of football governance, and that vote remains on the record, regardless of the plan's collapse. CONCACAF expressed outrage. The Asian Confederation stood in solidarity with UEFA. The English FA said it was deeply concerned about the lack of process and governance.
The institutional portrait those facts produce is not the portrait of a president who has retreated from one proposal and can now move forward with full authority restored. It is the portrait of a president whose own organization's chief operating officer said he ran a project of one person in secret and deceived the staff responsible for the institution he leads. That is a description of governance failure at the level of the presidency itself, not a project failure, not a policy mistake, but a description of how Infantino exercises his authority his election gave him. Here is the shareable sentence. A plan conceived in secret, attached to a payment one football figure called bribery, named the family connected to the host nation's leadership among its investors, collapsed in 4 days when FIFA's own chief operating officer told the world it was the project of one person who had deceived his colleagues. That sentence is the summary. It requires no embellishment and no allegation beyond what FIFA's own officials have confirmed in their own statements. The historical parallel that matters most is 2015. The federal indictments, the corruption convictions, the systematic documentation of how FIFA's governance had been exploited for private gain across decades. What emerged from that crisis was a reformed FIFA with a new president who promised a different institution. Infantino has been that president since 2016. His chief operating officer just told the world that a $20 billion proposal was the project of one person and that staff were deceived. That is not the description of a different institution. It is the description of the same institutional dynamics in a different commercial context. What happens next is genuinely uncertain in a way that few governance stories produce. Infantino retains his position. The September deadline has been abandoned along with the plan it was attached to. UEFA's boycott vote remains on the record. Cordero's resignation stands. Lamore's statement stands. And the questions about how Infantino exercises his authority, who he consults, what he discloses, how he distinguishes his own commercial relationships from the institutional interest of the governing body he leads, have not been answered by a statement saying the project will not proceed. What do you think? When FIFA's own chief operating officer says a $20 billion plan was the project of one person who deceived his colleagues, and when that plan collapses in 4 days under pressure from the institutions of European football, does that feel like a governance system correcting itself? Or does it feel like a specific plan being stopped while the conditions that produced it remain entirely in place? If you found this worth your time, a like helps more than you think. Subscribe if you enjoy thoughtful football coverage, and let me know your view in the comments. I read everyone. Infantino remains president. Lamore's statement stands. Cordero's resignation stands. UEFA's boycott vote stands. And the project of one person ended in 4 days, leaving every question it raised entirely unanswered.